I'm going to call our next speaker, Jason Johnson, who's the founding partner of the Laboratory of Integrative Design at the University of Calgary in Canada. He's taught and practiced all over North and South America, and he maintains a design research practice called Minus Architecture Studio, which has exhibited design related to generative design, digital fabrication, and integration techniques. Jason?
Okay, thank you. Got it. All right. Okay. Great. All right. I'm going to do this. I'm not texting, but I don't have a very good sense of time once I start talking, so it's a disease of architects everywhere. First of all, I'd like to thank the KC for the kind invitation, and especially Sujit and Smaran, who were very generous. I arrived a day early, just in time to take part in some of the action. And it afforded us an awesome opportunity to drive around with no traffic. So I got to see some of their projects and get to know the city a bit more. So that was great. I'd also like to thank Yamini for helping me in the seminar, and all the students who were really involved with making this a sort of great experience. It's always great to work with students, no matter where. I guess this can be adjusted. I don't have to slouch. Sort of in a lot of different settings. So that's something that was really interested me about coming here. It's one of the sort of areas of the three areas of what I do on a regular basis. Of course, I teach at the University of Calgary. I run a small research lab on campus with three other faculty members called the Laboratory for Integrative Design. And then I run a super small speculative office in Calgary as well, called Minus Architecture. What I'm going to talk about today is titled Ubiquitous Simultaneity on the Modification of Clouds. And it really talks about, I came across this essay a couple years ago. It's a book by Luke Howard from the 1800s, where he started to first categorize clouds. And what I thought was really interesting about the way that he talked about them was he really focused on kind of formal modification within a series of clouds as the way that he would describe lots of characteristics about them, including how they might make you feel in looking at them, but also the types of atmosphere that was present when those formal articulations were present as well. I also look at this, I love this term, pareidolia, which describes the kind of condition that I think everyone shares when looking at clouds, which is you see what you want to see in the cloud. I mean, you sort of engage in this kind of permanent or sort of continuously changing environment and project onto it ideas about what it is that you might be looking at. Of course, the kind of fascination with these formations isn't something that's new or that hasn't been looked at before. But I think it was specific in a lot of ways to moving to Canada and being in a city like Calgary, where we're right in a location where there's a continuous change in the cloud formation, which really affects the climate and the atmosphere of the entire city. So while the rest of Canada, west or east of the Rockies, might be incredibly cold, in Calgary you get days in the middle of winter that are, 15 to 20 degrees. And so that idea of that changing sort of wrapper of the landscape became a kind of driver for a series of projects that I'm going to go through now. They kind of change and bump back and forth in scale. And they really represent the way that we've been working over the last, let's say, 8 years, focusing on going from very small projects, testing the ideas physically, and then moving towards maybe larger scale proposals, and then kind of going back and forth between them. So that animation was obviously is a sort of computational technique, but what we were looking for, we were producing a wall and a gallery space for a conference on computation in 2011. And what we were trying to do is figure out how we might communicate some of that transitional quality of a cloud formation into what had to be a static installation. So I'll go through some of these fairly quickly. But looking at how each of those components would be made, I think it's really important. One of the things that I enjoyed about this workshop was that we had people who would come in and make stuff, just sort of with like half an hour notice. We would call somebody and they're like pouring concrete or something. That's not very common in North America, probably impossible. And so despite sort of other advances, we're quite behind in the ability to quickly produce something. I have to like make these files, send them to the shop. The guy's usually not there because he's on break. And then when he gets back, we sort of try and fabricate this thing. But in order to get them to understand it and to get people who are paying for these things to understand them, we have to produce these really sort of reductive diagrams that try to somehow maintain some of the effects present in the work in a way that they'll be able to understand what it is that we're after and why it's important for them to follow the instructions. So this is the final installation in the gallery. It was embedded with work of different architects. It's sort of a theme of a few of the projects we've done, is that we're producing a kind of armature in order to show the work of others. And this is sort of a 30-foot long piece in the gallery. And in the case of this project, we had quite a bit of time. So we knew we were doing the conference. Since I was organizing the conference, I hired myself to do the thing. And so I knew I had a year sort of to develop this, figure out the funding and everything to produce it. The next project I'm going to look at, that time frame was considerably reduced. So we were working with the Canadian equivalent of the IIA, the RAIC, seemingly not quite as organized as you guys are here. We had about 4 weeks to produce a pavilion for their main event that happens every year that was visiting Calgary. So by the time we were actually given the go-ahead to do the project, we had very limited time. We met with one of the organizers, and he threw out the schemes we'd spent a couple months working on because they were too expensive. And we ended up doing a sort of sketch in 5 minutes and throwing a few of them away until we sort of built this giant pair of pants as a TV screen for this event. So one of the things that was interesting about having to showcase the work of architects in a downtown setting of a city is that this actual act of presenting visual information to one another has been shrunk down from and sort of is almost now invisible. So whereas when I was a kid, my uncle, who was very thrifty, had 2 giant televisions stacked on each other, one that the sound worked and one that the picture worked, and you'd click them around. They took up the entire space. I mean, you knew who had a TV, how big the TV was, what the TV could do, if it was color, black and white, had fancy wood around it, to the point where now, most of us probably consume 90% of our visual information on something, the size of this. And we're looking at how do you actually take back, in a way, it all becomes invisible to us. So you're walking down the street, things are being displayed at you continuously on really flat screens attached to buildings, and we wanted to let the city, which is fairly conservative in terms of architecture, have to deal with an object that was communicating to them and also interfering in the way that they move through the city. So we conceived of this object as a large sort of public television. We called it a fat screen, and put it right in the middle of the sidewalk on the sort of busiest street downtown, and proposed that this would sort of sit opposite the venue and project the images. This was for the work of young architects in the city, and it was up only for a week. So we had sort of a lot of fabrication into this, but we had a very constrained time schedule. So whereas typically in a lot of projects you'll see, and these are 2 sort of beautiful projects to the left, produced by some other friends of ours or colleagues that we've met in the past, that rely on very precise and specific computational techniques to produce a sort of perfectly smooth surface. Highly articulated, very smooth, incredibly time consuming. We had, a couple days to mill all the sheets. So there's no point in sort of trying to fight that condition. And so we worked with a guy who had a mill in his garage or barn, and who, unlike our shop techs at the university, was willing to just crank it up to 11 and let it go as fast as it could possibly go for 3 or 4 days. And using a kind of material that was pretty rustic in its layers. So this is marine plywood, and half of the layers are tar. So they're black layers in between, and you could really start to register the patterns through the coloration of, or the colors within the material itself, but also in respect to the tool paths. So we, unlike a lot of projects where we really finely tune and control the milling paths or the paths of sort of carving away the material, we let the machine figure out the fastest way and then dealt with the effects afterwards. So what we ended up getting was this sort of really chopped up surface. The edges started to sort of splinter. And we kind of played up that effect as much as possible throughout the piece itself. This is the piece in the city during the event. These little hooligans on there are my kids. And then at night, the whole piece kind of lights up and engages the streetscape within the city. So we're really referencing both the first project in terms of some of the aesthetic modeling choices we had used, and also this next project, which had explored the same thing at a larger scale. This was a project for the Helsinki Central Library, and we worked together with Synthetics, another collaborator in Calgary that I work with pretty often, to propose a this object that we called the ambient exchange. So the idea within this project was that the perforated skin allowed it to engage. It's in a sort of prominent site in the city, and the brief of the project was a bit strange in some ways, in that it was asking not so much for a library that was a repository of knowledge, but a kind of large assimilation machine. So a lot of the program was around this idea of people immigrating to Finland, learning what it's like to be Finnish, which was kind of, it had a sauna and like a sausage restaurant in the program, which is weird for a library, at least for me, as well as a lot of training facilities. So the idea was that this porous exterior would in some ways physically reinforce that idea that's going on within the program. So it's situated between these sort of institutions on the site and oriented in such a way as to engage them visually from the interior, but then in the program of the building through these kind of ramps that connect the various levels of circulation and security interfaces within the building. So parts of this building are 24-hour access, and other parts are only open during library hours. So throughout the building, we have these kind of pods, which you can see interspersed throughout the floor plan, that represent meeting spaces, interspersed through the kind of stacks, and that are continuously producing kind of private spaces, but that are also exposed through the skin to the sky outside of the project and form a kind of ambient layer inside of this otherwise artificially lit interior. These are sort of some of the studies of the skin. And again, looking at a layered surface on the exterior that would sort of reinforce this idea that it's being weathered while at the same time participating in the sort of ambientation of the interior. Some quick interior shots. This project's not really finished, and we don't have great renderings or photographs yet. So, but I was asked to kind of show this, so it's kind of odd to do it a little freaky. But this is a project. So in Calgary, like many North American cities, we have a fairly restrictive building code and zoning ordinance, and the result is that most of the houses look that are new infills look fairly similar to one another in that they're built out just basically to the constraints that they're allowed, and there's no design beyond that. So we had a client that came to us who had a somewhat, we'll say, combative approach to his neighbors. So he didn't actually want to have to ever engage with them, but he also wanted to do a house that wasn't like any of their houses. And so we went through a series of proposals of how we might start to develop something. So this is a sort of early design phase that would be in direct opposition to this kind of development. So where the main design, I guess, fancy bits in these houses are, perhaps a bump out for a window or some pop outs on the sides. He really wanted to do something that would, in a way, give his neighbors kind of the back of his shoulders. Anyway, so these are the plans of the project. We have a kind of basement layer. There's no law underground in Calgary, so you can sort of build whatever you want as long as it's underground and within your site properties or property lines. So we initially proposed just building everything underground. He didn't go for that. So we had quite a lot of the program underground, and then sort of pushing it up through the house around this open stair space, and then connecting that to the upper portion of the house. I'll go through these quickly, as I'm getting close to my time. And articulating that sort of light nostril going down into the house on the sides of the building. So we had a very limited amount of windows you can have on the sides, but we really wanted to get light into the building, and screening off views from the neighbors into the building and even the porch. So a lot of houses are required to have porches. Their idea was they wanted a porch that someone couldn't actually see them if they were on their porch or kind of approach them. I'm going to move on from that. This project is something that's going on site next month. The other scale of stuff that we're working at now is public art. So that'll be the last two proposals here. This one is currently going on site. It's the Lemonitis wall. It's a kind of piece that attaches to the edge of to the side of a new sports facility for Edmonton, Alberta. In Canada, as everyone knows, it's very cold, but also very sunny in Alberta. And so there's lots of change in temperature that produces kind of ice and melting, and then sort of more ice and snow and melting. And our proposal was to sort of build this piece on the side of the building that would collect that precipitation in its various states and really kind of be a live piece of that building. The project's not really about butterflies, but clients love butterflies at least in Canada. And so we sort of produced these series of drawings to sell the project in a very kind of lyrical way to them about the idea of this sort of exposing the kind of narrative elements of the building through something that's life cycle is really understandable to most people. So this is a rendering of that facade in the daytime and the night. Oops. Yeah. And these are the sort of preliminary pieces that we've been testing, kind of finishes and how to attach this project to the building itself. Alongside this kind of research, it's really focused on building things and engaging kind of the public through art and through, in a way, form making. I've been working on another body of research with a colleague of mine, Matt Parker, and looking specifically at this idea of ubiquitous simultaneity, something that we're describing as the kind of world in which everything can be accessed through something like as small as this, including a huge repository of architectural information. Architects are giving away design at an incredible rate. Probably just the four of us who will speak today have given away, hundreds of thousands of dollars in design hours for nothing, right? For some nice renders that we can show you guys. And probably many of you have done the same. And this system is producing a lot of, we could just say, architectural waste, right? So one of the projects gets built, everything else is, put on websites and kind of is part of a discourse, but in a lot of ways disappears. And so what we started to do was think about how all of this information is a resource like any sort of recycling dump, right? And how we could start to filter that information and understand it to recycle it in a way. All of these projects have a lot of design thinking that's gone into them. Some of them have quite deep theoretical underpinnings to them. All of that is kind of embedded into their drawings, the drawings that we all understand: plans, section, elevations, and renderings. And so we've been working with a computer vision algorithm that sees sort of images, is able to capture catalogs of them, and then combine large sets of images to produce these kind of composite products that read as kind of composite plans from lots of plans. So we're not computer scientists, which means we're using a sort of blunt tool at this point. If anyone knows a programmer, that's probably the right country for that, who wants to work on this, great. But what we've been doing is actually trying to produce a series of protocols that allow us to convert maybe more highly specific knowledge, like which programs and how they're distributed through buildings typically. So we look at maybe every museum from the Helsinki competition that was a finalist is what we did for this project. And we figured out where all the program was being distributed through the buildings and looked for similarities within those mappings to produce kind of new diagrams of that program. In other words, if 90% of the people are placing certain programmatic elements in the same spot of their buildings, that type of information became rigid in the model, and the other information is kind of up for grabs. So we've done several rounds of this project, each time getting a bit more precise. Still not getting, I mean, that's the cover of the book we put out this year, but it's still not getting to anything that maybe appears yet to be kind of highly functional building, but we think it's sort of a hyper architecture nonetheless. The last two projects we'll look at are in this in the public art sphere, and they kind of connect the ideas of clouds and how we see things within them and how we see things within projects or read. We want to produce projects that can't be read so precisely by people. So in public art projects, it's a bit easier to do this. So we've got two projects that are proposals for a public art space. It's an old historical building in Calgary that was the King Edward School. So it was named after, obviously, King Edward, but it also formed the background of a series of schools that were sponsored by the Crown throughout Canada. And we were asked specifically, how would these projects integrate some of the historical references within these buildings into the public art? Typically in Calgary, this leads to these kind of mural proposals. They're like, hey, here's this history of something, so we'll paint a picture of that history. And we were trying to avoid that. So the first proposal looks specifically at pieces of the building and how we might try to inflate those pieces. It called for objects that would rest on these plinths on the front of the building, and kind of be the gateway to that building. So we looked at chunks of those buildings and then running them through a series of kind of inflation protocols, produced these proposals for these large kind of sentry columns that would sit outside of the building and again take on different characteristics depending on the weather. And the second proposal was for the entryway of this same building, where we looked at these kind of two figures, one in the vestibule and one in the main stair, that would kind of dialogue with one another and reference the history of the site itself. So going through a lot of the, sorry, these aren't super clear on the screen. I'm going through a lot of the historical documents that were provided to us there's a real focus on this. They love the crest. Who doesn't love a good crest, I guess, of the school, and this idea that it was tied to a sort of royal institution, so everything had like a crest and a crown on it. And so we started looking at pattern generation based on those two particular pieces. And the proposal is this sort of highly articulated ceiling that's in the room with the stairs, and then this hanging kind of crown-like chandelier that hangs in the kind of foyer entryway. And so we're actually presenting this to you're seeing it before the client, but I figured no one's tweeting this out today. So we'll present this next week. But this is the kind of type of work that we do. And so I think I'll finish here. The idea is that, while we're working within a kind of series of digital tools, the only time it really comes up when we're talking to clients, or that they ever care about it, is how does that make the process like more understandable, quicker, or frankly, more affordable to them. And so we find that we're producing a lot of these diagrams that describe the process, but really are completely different in the nature of what they're showing than the actual types of computational processes we're using to produce the project itself. So, it's kind of that they've become representational, but at the same time really embedded within. Those two logics are becoming highly integrated within projects. And so I think that this ability to see kind of what you want to see within both the processes of architecture and the architecture itself are kind of increasingly coming to the forefront in an era when we can see everything, right? So we can see any project everywhere. When I was in the undergrad, we got magazines maybe once a month, usually late, sometimes destroyed in the mail, and that selection was 4 projects and lots of ads. And I think now, in this time when you can see everything, it's even more critical that you can start to understand what it is you want to see and how you're going to produce the things that you want to see. Thank you.